Welcome to a deep dive, and this one really has me thinking, like, are we even doing justice right? We're diving into Jesus Justice this week,
Right.
which
Yeah.
that's the article you sent over, right? By the Jamin Bradley.
Jamin Bradley.
Yeah.
Okay, just maybe sure I got the right one. But even just the title, it's like, whoa,
Yeah.
this is something different, something deeper
It really
than how
is.
we usually talk about this stuff.
He sets that tone right away.
Right, from the beginning, yeah.
Remember that first scene he describes? He's at this like secular justice event,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
and it's like he's hearing a foreign language almost. Like
Yes.
there's this disconnect.
Totally. You can feel it in his words, that tension.
Yeah.
Like he's trying to make sense of it all, but through the lens of his own faith,
Right. Exactly.
which leads him to this whole Jesus justice thing. And what really struck me was how he roots it in this ancient but still radical idea of the image of God.
Mhm.
It's not just about being nice to each other.
It's deeper than that. It's about how we view every single person, even the ones who've messed up, even the ones who've hurt us.
And that's what's so mind-blowing about it, even all these centuries later. I mean, Bradley points out that back then, in other cultures, only, like kings and royalty,
Belief.
they were the only ones considered to reflect God's image.
Oh, interesting.
But in the Hebrew Bible, it's everyone. It's
Yeah.
every human being. Can you imagine how revolutionary that must have been?
It totally changes the whole power dynamic, right? Because suddenly everyone has this inherent value just by existing.
Exactly.
Not because of what they've done or their status, but just because they are. But then how does that play out, when you've actually been wronged by someone? Because
Yeah.
Bradley's also talking about loving your enemies, and that's
That's a tough one.
it's a really hard one.
And he doesn't shy away from that, which is interesting too.
No, he doesn't.
He's not saying to just like excuse harmful actions or anything like that.
Right. It's about seeing that shared humanity, even in those moments.
Yes, and recognizing that shared humanity.
Yeah.
Like he uses that example of the stolen bike.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe the person who stole it was desperate. They felt like they had no other choice.
Out of options. Yeah.
It doesn't make it right,
Right.
but it adds a layer of understanding.
It does.
What do you think, listener? Have you ever...
It makes me think of that saying, hurt people hurt people.
Right. Exactly.
But this takes it a step further, right? Because then Bradley brings in this idea of cruciform Christianity.
Yes, and that's where...
Which honestly, at
It's
first,
a mouthful.
it sounds a little intense, right? Like, whoa, what is that?
Right, like something out of a history book, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But the way he explains it,
Yeah.
it's not about just like words, it's about action,
Exactly.
right? It's about living out.
Embodying it,
Yeah, embodying that love, that radical love that Jesus demonstrated.
especially in the face of suffering.
And the sacrifice, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And he highlights those examples from Jesus' life, like his pacifism,
Right.
his willingness to forgive when most people would be, rightfully angry.
Yeah.
And he was condemned unjustly.
Yeah.
His constant outreach to people who were marginalized, overlooked. It's like he's saying, look at how Jesus moved through the world. Are we even trying to do the same?
It's challenging, for sure.
It is, yeah. And I think that's where Bradley really shakes us up a little. He's saying this cruciform living, it's not like an optional thing for Christians.
Yeah.
It's not just like a bonus level you unlock if you're feeling extra holy.
Right, right.
It's about those fruits of the Spirit he talks about, love, joy, peace.
All those good things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those qualities.
That's not just for us, right?
Exactly. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to cultivate these so I can feel good about myself.
Yeah.
It's about letting them overflow into how we deal with the messed up stuff in the world.
So it's connected to that idea of justice, then it's not just like our personal little bubble of faith. It's about how we actually engage with the world around us.
Yes. And he even says we need these qualities before things get tough.
Oh, interesting.
It's not like you can just flip a switch when you see injustice and suddenly become this beacon of peace and patience.
Right, right.
You have to be cultivating that stuff all the time.
It's like training for a marathon, right? You don't just show up on race day and expect to win.
Exactly. Got to put in the work beforehand.
But I gotta be honest, when I think about like facing down injustice, my instinct is more like fight or flight,
Right.
not necessarily love and peace. Like, how do you actually put that into practice when there are real victims, real harm? Does Jesus' justice just like ignore that?
That's such a good question. And Bradley, to his credit, he addresses that directly.
Okay, good.
He's not saying to just be passive or pretend that actions don't have consequences.
Right.
He's not saying to erase accountability.
It's not about letting people off the hook.
Exactly. But he distinguishes between, like, having empathy, which helps us understand why someone might do something wrong.
Yeah, like their story, their background.
Right, their context.
Yeah.
And excusing their actions.
So you can understand without condoning.
Exactly.
Got it.
It's like holding those two things in tension, you know?
So extending grace and understanding, but also knowing that there needs to be justice.
Yes. And he even talks about forgiveness. Like, we're called to offer forgiveness.
Right.
But that doesn't mean you have to stay in a situation where you're being hurt.
Right, or abused. Or
Exactly. It doesn't negate boundaries or the need for safety.
That makes sense.
It's about holding people accountable for their actions while also seeing their humanity.
Okay, I'm with you.
But then the question becomes, how do we actually do that?
Right, like how do you move from this idea, this concept of Jesus' justice,
Right.
to actually creating a more just world? Like, what are the
Well-
steps? So we're trying to balance this idea of grace and accountability, understanding, but also action.
Right. It's a tricky one.
It really is. It feels like, I don't know, like walking a tightrope sometimes.
Yeah.
Where does Bradley even suggest we start? Like, if we're going to build a more just world, but through this lens of Jesus' justice.
Well, that's where it gets really fascinating because he doesn't give us, like, a 10-step plan.
Okay.
It's not that simple.
Right.
He goes back to that idea of, like, surrendering to something bigger than ourselves.
Okay.
He says, true Jesus justice isn't about us trying to force our own ideas of what's fair.
Right. Like our limited human perspective.
Exactly. Because those are always going to be flawed in some way, right?
Yeah.
It's about aligning ourselves with God's definition of justice.
So it's almost like saying our human attempts at justice, they're always going to fall short if they're not grounded in something deeper.
Yes. And he even goes so far as to say that, like, any attempt to pursue justice outside of God's guidance,
Okay.
outside of those principles that Jesus embodied, it's ultimately going to fail. He has this line, there is no true justice outside his gavel.
Whoa.
It's kind of a powerful image, isn't it?
It is.
It's humbling in a way. Like, we can't just rely on our own logic or good intentions.
Right. It's like, how do we even tap into that? What does it actually look like to operate in that Jesus justice space?
Yeah. And it doesn't mean we just sit around waiting for God to fix everything.
Right.
He's not saying that at all. It starts with us.
Okay.
It starts with looking at our own hearts. Like, what are we motivated by? Are we driven by anger or a desire for revenge?
Right.
Or are we coming from a place of love?
Okay.
That same compassion and desire for restoration that Jesus modeled.
It's like it forces us to be honest with ourselves, right?
Totally. It's uncomfortable sometimes.
It is, yeah, because it's easy to look at injustice out there and be like, that's wrong. They need to be held accountable.
Right, exactly.
But are we willing to do that same work on ourselves to make sure our own pursuit of justice is lining up with, with love and compassion and all those things?
Yes, and I think that's where Bradley leaves us with this call to action.
Okay.
But it's rooted in deep introspection,
Right.
It's not enough to just listen to this and be like, yeah, that sounds nice.
Right.
It's about letting these ideas actually change how we see the world.
How we treat each other.
Exactly. Especially the people we disagree with, the ones who've hurt us.
The ones who are hardest to love, yeah.
Yeah. Remembering that image of God in every person.
That inherent dignity he talked about.
Yes, and letting that guide our actions, not just our words.
It's a challenge, for sure, but it's hopeful, too.
It's incredibly hopeful. It's a call to become agents of restoration and redemption.
To build that more just world, but not through force or judgment.
Right, but through love, through radical love, through unwavering compassion. That's the heart of Jesus' justice.
That's what Bradley's inviting us into, right?
That's the invitation he's putting forward, yeah.
So, listener, how will you respond? How will you choose to live out Jesus' justice in your own life, in your own corner of the world? We hope this deep dive has given you some new ways to think about it, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.